Well, good morning, everyone, on this chilly July day. So good to see you all here. My name is Christopher Gwynn. I serve as the Chief of Interpretation and Education at Gettysburg National Military Park. And on behalf of the National Park Service, as well as our partners, the Gettysburg Foundation, I want to welcome you all to the annual Sacred Trust Lecture Series. Over the course of the previous few days and continuing this weekend, the Gettysburg Foundation, along with the National Park Service, are offering a host of different walks, talks, lectures, book signings here at the Gettysburg National Military Park Museum and Visitor Center, as well as out on the battlefield itself. I would encourage you all, if you don't have one of our anniversary guides, this lists all of the park ranger programs as well as the Sacred Trust Lecture Series. Please grab one of those on the way out. It'll go over all of the different opportunities you have to engage with the history of this place. And again, we're so grateful that you've chosen to be out here with us. It is my great honor to be able to introduce the gentleman who actually brought the Sacred Trust series back to life. I know many of you know him. Wayne Motts is the President Emeritus of the Gettysburg Foundation. He serves as the Chief Historian of the Gettysburg Foundation as well. And the work that he's done to highlight the history of this amazing place, to share it online through his programming, to share it through events like this, the Sacred Trust, has really been an enormous benefit to the people that come here to engage with this story, this history. So please join me in welcoming Wayne Motts.
Boy, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Chris, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I want to recognize Chris Gwynn, our Chief of Interpretation and Education, also Dr. Carol Reardon, who is in the House, the chair of the Gettysburg Foundation's Education Committee, and the three of us in planning for Sacred Trust. I want to thank the staff of the Gettysburg Foundation, who are all around, who helped make this possible, and also the staff of the National Park Service for all their hard work and everything they do. So it's really great that we're here today, and we've got a wonderful lineup of programs for all of you here. I would ask that if you have a cell phone, to please silence it. And the routine will be, with these lectures, we will introduce the speaker will speak, I will moderate some question and answer period time immediately after the presentation, and then our speaker, if they have books, will be inside the visitor center signing for at least 1 hour after the presentation. So between the breaks of the programs, you all need to run inside and pick up the speaker's book that you just heard, okay? And you can help support the foundation and the National Park Service in that manner. Let's talk a little bit about our speaker and his subject, which is on General Albert Sidney Johnston and the Civil War in the West. It comes from his book, The Iron Dice of Battle, everyone. Albert Sidney Johnston is well known, but not fully understood. Perhaps the best way to analyze his life in Confederate command is by examining him as a gambler. His early life shows traits of such gambling when life or death or life-altering situations confronted him, and similarly, there will be times when he put family or army organization at risk with gambles. Johnston certainly did so in his tenure as the Western Theater Confederate commander, and much like a gambler, he had to bluff and deceive with a strict poker face. He did so until the enemy upped the ante with the shocking Confederate defeats at Forts Henry and Donelson. Johnston ultimately had to call his opponent's hand, which he did at Shiloh, where he declared he must, quote, roll the iron dice of battle, end quote. It was a gamble to be sure, but it had to be done, or as stated it, the Confederate Army must, quote, conquer or perish. Of course, he perished, and his defeat on top of the setbacks earlier in 1862 led to the terrible, dismal situation for the Confederacy, especially in the West, that far outlived his tenure as commander. Our speaker, Dr. Timothy B. Smith, Mississippi State University, 2001, is a veteran of the National Park Service and currently teaches history at the University of Tennessee at Martin, Tennessee. In addition to his numerous articles and essays, he is the author, editor, or co-editor of more than 20 books with several university and commercial presses. His books have won numerous awards, with his trilogy on the American Civil War's Tennessee River campaigns, Fort Henry, Donelson, Shiloh, and Corinth, winning a total of 9 book awards. He is currently finishing a 5-volume study of the Vicksburg campaign for the University of Press of Kansas and a new study of Albert Sidney Johnston for LSU Press. Timothy lives with his wife Kelly and daughters Mary Kate and Leah Grace in Adamsville, Tennessee. One of his daughters is with him this morning, and you wonder what he does in his day off. He's with us on Sacred Trust, everybody. Please welcome Dr. Tim Smith.
Well, thank you very much. Woo, y'all keep it warm up here. It's I am used to it a little bit. I grew up in Mississippi, of course, and this is nothing new. I wasn't really expecting it up here, though. Actually, I do have my younger daughter down there, Leah Grace. She came with me. We spent the day in Washington, D.C. yesterday looking at all the monuments and all that, and it wasn't but, 99 or so yesterday in Washington. So that prepared us just a little bit. But thank you for having us up here. I love coming to Gettysburg. I've been here numerous times. I think I remember the first time I came, I was, 10 years old. This was like the early 80s or so. And we actually hired, I've seen several guides around. We actually hired a guide. It would be interesting to know who it was. I'm sure some of you might know whoever it was 40 years ago. But love coming to Gettysburg. You have a wonderful battlefield up here, wonderful staff, and so thank you for having us up here. Here we are on the anniversary week of the Battle of Gettysburg, at the Gettysburg battlefield, and logically we're going to talk about Shiloh. So that fits perfect, right? And so yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about the West. Shiloh, how many of you have been to Shiloh? I'm guessing in a group like, wow, y'all see the hands, the bunches of you. Vicksburg, how many of you have been to Vicksburg? I know several of you have because I've toured you around. Karen back there, Wally, others, Wayne has. I've seen several friends that I haven't seen in a while, so good to see all of you. Even a neighbor back there, you lived across the street from us for several years, now lives in where, Jason? Hanover, I believe, and so just 20 minutes away and came over, so good to see him. But if you've been to Shiloh, if you've been to Vicksburg, you're a little bit versed in the war in the West. And this is neither the time nor the place to get into where the war was won and lost, the West versus the East and all that. We're not going to talk a lot about that, but we are going to talk about one of the major factors in the dismal Confederate performance in the West, and that is obviously Albert Sidney Johnston. Now, Johnston does have a connection a little bit with at least those here in the East. Albert Sidney Johnston actually outranks your very own Robert E. Lee. You know, if you go in the hierarchy of Confederate generals, there are 5 full Confederate generals in the Confederacy, and I know in a group like this, if we started naming and did trivia time, all of you would be able to name them, because you don't come to something like this when it's 180 degrees and sit through a talk like this or multiple talks unless you're really interested in this. But you all know that Samuel Cooper is the highest ranking Confederate general. He never leaves his desk really in Washington. I always joke that he commands a desk Richmond. He commands a desk in Richmond and doesn't do that terribly effectively, I don't think. But when you get into field command with the other 4, Albert Sidney Johnston is next in line, outranking Robert E. Lee and the other 2, of course, Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. Later on, Braxton Bragg is added as a full general. We won't even discuss him. It's way too hot to discuss Braxton Bragg. But we have him added, so there are 6 full Confederate generals in the 5 slots. Now, some of you will be thinking, what about Kirby Smith? What about John Bell Hood? They're anomalies. Kirby Smith in the Provisional Confederate Army, not one of the full 5 generals. John Bell Hood, temporary, and all that. We don't even need to talk about Hood. But at in terms of the 5 full generals, Albert Sidney Johnston is the highest-ranking Confederate field commander. And, of course, he will be sent out west as soon as he reaches Richmond in September of 1861, and he will take command out there. Now, why look at Albert Sidney Johnston? Why write a book on him? It's a semi-biography. I didn't want to go into the entire life of Albert Sidney Johnston, and in particular, it's because we already have a major, very good biography of Albert Sidney Johnston. How many of you are familiar with the historian Charlie Rowland? Anybody familiar with him? Anybody know Charlie Rowland? Knew him when we got several that actually knew Charlie Rowland. Carol does back there. He's a wonderful guy. If you ever had a chance to be around him, he was absolutely wonderful. He died a couple of years ago, Carol, I believe, 2 years ago at 104 years old. So he had been around, he had seen everything, done everything, fought in World War II, all of that. Wonderful storyteller, all of that, wonderful historian. In fact, I did a tour with him, and you talk about some big names and all that. I think it was 2012, we did a tour of Shiloh. I was the play-by-play guy, did the tour, but doing the color commentary kind of was for the Confederate side, Charlie Rowland, and he was probably 90 years old at that point. We could do the math, but for the Union side is John Marzalek. So you've got a Sherman biographer and a Johnston biographer doing the color commentary and all that. It was absolutely wonderful. But I remember we were on the bus and we were talking about. This was the sesquicentennial, and we're talking about the centennial or the bicentennial coming up in 50 years, of course. And they were kidding me about, you'll still be around, I'll be 80-something, whatever years old when it comes around. But we'd been joking back and forth and all that, and I just made the comment on the bus that Professor Rowland probably going to outlive all of us and be here for the bicentennial and all of that. And he said, I don't even buy green bananas at this point. So he, but he had a wonderful career, wonderful man. But I thought there was, I don't want to say something missing, but in terms of his Albert Sidney Johnston biography, I think there was more to be said. Now, that's not to say anything about his biography or his methodology or anything like that. In fact, the reason that I didn't do a standard full biography was because his is so good. There is no need to rehash what he did up until the Civil War because it's just that good. If you've read Albert Sidney Johnston, Soldier of Three Republics, you understand. There's no need to rehash that. I thought, though, that there is a need to look again at his Civil War career, at Johnston's Civil War career, because if Professor Rowland's biography starts to, I don't want to say break down, but it gets a little weaker as it gets into the Civil War, and particularly as it gets into Shiloh. And there's a fundamental reason for this. He wrote this in the early 1960s, which predates all of the historiography of the battles, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson. There are 3 major studies of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. His biography predated all of those, so he didn't have that literature to work with. There are 5 major studies of the Battle of Shiloh. All of them are published after his biography came out. So he did not have that historiography to work with and that literature to work with. And so he was blazing new ground, obviously. And so, 70 years later, I look at this and I say, there's no need for a new biography. His biography is so good, particularly early on, that we don't need to redo this like we do many of the other centennial era biographies. I don't keep up as much on Gettysburg and the Corps commanders and all that, but I do know there's a book about every other hour that comes out on Gettysburg up here, and the Corps commanders, and now the Corps and all of that kind of stuff. So there's probably not a lot of definitive biographies from the 1960s of some of your generals up here. I don't know. But out west, people like William Rosecrans or P.G.T. Beauregard or some of those others the definitive biography dates from the 1960s, and so there is a definite need to up the historiography and to modernize it a little bit with all these studies that have come out. Not necessarily so with Albert Sidney Johnston, except in the Civil War times. So I thought I'm going to look at Albert Sidney Johnston and his Civil War career, and that's mainly what the book is, Albert Sidney Johnston, the Civil War in the West. So as I started looking at Johnston, I thought I'd have to be very careful here, because as a historian, you never want to fall in love with your subject. You don't want there to be any hero worship or anything like that. And I was afraid there might be a little bit of that, because I've always loved Albert Sidney Johnston. Grew up in Mississippi, in the 70s and 80s, and what little boy in Mississippi is not going to, charge with a Confederate flag and all of that kind of stuff. So, I had always just thought Albert Sidney Johnston was the man. You go to his grave in Austin. How many of you been to Albert Sidney Johnston's grave in Austin? We got Wally has. Wally, you've been to the moon, I bet, haven't you, Wally? You've been everywhere, but very ornate, just awe-inspiring grave there in the Texas State Cemetery, all of that. So I had to watch a little bit and say, I don't want to get too far into hero worship here. Very much watch against that. As it turned out, that wasn't a concern, because I don't see Albert Sidney Johnston as a great general, and it doesn't really pain me to say that, but it surprises me to say that a little bit. I just don't think he was a very good general, and I'll give you several different reasons for that. Looking at his life, the book is a semi-biography in terms of there are a couple of chapters, pre-Civil War chapters, that lead up to his Civil War days, and so there are a couple of reasons for including those. Number one, I wanted those that maybe haven't read Professor Rowland's book, or those that haven't read Albert Sidney Johnston's son's book. It's about that thick. It's a big, huge, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. You talk about hero worship. But what son's not going to think his dad's a hero? All of that. But for those that haven't read the context of his life, I wanted there to be a little bit of getting you up to speed on Johnston and all that. The other thing that I wanted to do in those earlier chapters was to bring out patterns in Johnston's life before the Civil War that we see also emerge during the Civil War that impacted his command, if you will, the command mentality of the Confederacy's highest-ranking field general. And so we see that in terms of his personality that develops throughout his pre-war years that carry over into his war years. Just to give you some examples, I don't think Johnston was a very good general. Number one, because he was very methodical, too methodical. He had to think through things. It took him a little while to think through things. He couldn't really think fast on his feet. And there are numerous historians that have talked about this. People at the time, contemporary people at the time, talked about how methodical he was. And I equate this, I kind of compare this a little bit, and we'll get into this a little bit later on as well. But I equate this to Johnston being a chess player. And he liked to talk about how he always played, that was his game of choice. He loved chess, and he liked to sit and think. And how many of you play chess? Anybody a chess player in here? It's a very cerebral game. You have to sit and think strategy, all that kind of stuff, right? And so Johnston was a thinker. He was very methodical and wanted to take time, step back, survey the situation, and then make a plan and follow that. Unfortunately, in wartime, particularly when you're facing an enemy commander who doesn't always do what you want him to do or what you think he's going to do, somebody very aggressive like Ulysses S. Grant, he doesn't always give you time to stop and think. You can't send a message over and say, okay, Ulysses S. Grant, I'm calling a timeout here, and we're going to stop and let me think about this for a minute to see what I'm going to do, and then we'll go back to this. There's nothing like this. And so I equate Johnston, the chess player, the methodical thinker, to being placed in a fast-paced, high-stakes poker game. And so think you chess players, if you were suddenly thrown into a fast-paced poker game where you got to bet and bluff and all that kind of stuff, he just doesn't perform very well in that situation. Had he had time to sit back and think about what he's doing and all that, he might have performed a little bit better. But thrown into the situation that he was thrown into, he doesn't respond very well because he's slower, he's methodical, and it just doesn't work out very well in terms of his military command. Another reason that he's not a very good commander is that he is just too lenient. He's very forgiving. And the way I describe it, he's basically too nice of a guy to be a good general. Any of y'all generals? We may have a general in the house. I don't know. Anybody know a general? You know, the mentality of a general, we got to be kind of firm, go, you know, you think of the crusty old general type thing, you know, rah, 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 go, go, go type thing. Johnston's just too nice of a guy. I'll give you a couple of examples again from his earlier life. At one point, when he buys his plantation out in Texas, China Grove, the neighbor, they had been into spats and all that, and the neighbor fed the dog, the Johnston family dog, strychnine. He killed the dog. And so the dog comes home, and he's convulsing and dying right there. Johnston says right there in front of wife, kids, everybody, and the dog dies right there. Now, pre-Civil War, Texas, somebody kills your dog, what are you going to go do? Vigilante justice type thing, right? And some people say, well, go kill the guy, you know, go take care of the situation. And Johnston says, no, killing that guy won't bring the dog back or remove the memories of what the kids saw of their dog, you know, dying in front of their eyes and all that kind of stuff. So what good will it do to go kill that guy? Just more killing. He's very, very lenient in what the current culture of Texas, vigilante justice and all that, would dictate otherwise. Another example, in the 1850s, he was a paymaster for the U.S. Army. He was a major, and he would go around to the different Texas forts with the money, the gold in the lockbox and all that, and he would issue the payroll. Well, over time, he figured out that he was hemorrhaging money. He was losing money, and he wasn't taking it, of course, and he had the key and all of that. Well, he finally figured out that his slave that he would take with him to drive and cook and all of that had made a skeleton key and was getting in there, and he was taking from the pot a little bit. And so not a lot, you know, but just a little as he went along. It ultimately amounted to like $1,500 or so, which is a lot of money in pre-Civil War days. But he figured out the slave was taking the money, and when he figured out all this, some, you know, others said, well, beat the slave and all of that, whip him and all that. Johnston refused. He said, no, a lifetime of good treatment to the slave has not made him honest, so whipping him now is not going to do any good either. So, you know, just those couple of examples lead you to believe that he's very lenient, he's very nice, he's very forgiving. But again, when you take that type of person and put him in a wartime, fast-paced wartime situation, it doesn't turn out too well, and we see that throughout the Western campaign here. For instance, his chief subordinates, if you know your Western history, for instance, at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, who were Johnston's chief subordinates? I actually call them the Three Stooges, John Floyd, Gideon Pilla, and Simon Bolivar Buckner. I have since revised that. I don't think Buckner was a stooge, so we just got two stooges. But Pilla and Floyd definitely were probably worse than stooges. At any rate, Johnston had a hard time commanding these subordinates because he was too lenient. He would give them orders, and they would say, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. And Johnston would say, oh, okay, whatever. But the reason for this and the leniency with his subordinates and the failure to command, I think Johnston, he always perceived in terms of manhood, and I don't want to get into, you know, social wonkiness and all that kind of stuff, but in terms of his subordinates in the Civil War, because he had been vaulted up to a very high command, he now commanded people who were his superiors earlier on in life. For instance, John Floyd at Fort Donelson. He now is commanding Floyd, tells Floyd to do something, and Floyd doesn't do it, and Johnston says, well, all right, well, let's do something else. Who was John Floyd prior to the Civil War? Secretary of War, while Johnston was just a colonel. Well, see, just a colonel. If any colonels out there, no offense, but in terms of Secretary of War and colonel, a colonel is way down there. So if the Secretary of War, former Secretary of War, is now under you, Johnston still sees that as, ooh, this is the Secretary of War type thing. Gideon Pillow, another example. Who was Gideon Pillow earlier? Mexican War. A division commander under Winfield Scott. Johnston, again, was a colonel. Gideon Pillow, a division commander. Leonidas Polk. Who was Leonidas Polk? Well, besides a very, very bad general, he was also a West Point graduate, went into the ministry and all that kind of stuff, but he had been Johnston's roommate. So, you look at Beauregard, who was the hero of Manassas, hero of Fort Sumter and all that. All these guys that Johnston had trouble commanding and forcing to do his will had either been his equal or his superior earlier in life, and he finds it very, very difficult then to command them, and he's just too lenient, and he doesn't have that harshness, that rah, that you go do this. I don't care who you were beforehand. You go do this. This is what I want you to do. So he's very methodical. He's very lenient. But then the other thing, the last thing, and we see this again in his previous, not previous life, but earlier life, he gets into these situations where there's a crisis point, and he tends to overreact. And I think we see this in the idea that he's a chess player in a poker game. And so the idea is that he thinks, okay, everything is at an end. I'm ruined unless I bet everything I've got on one hand, and I've got to win it all. So he becomes kind of a compulsive gambler. Anybody know a compulsive gambler that just can't stop, just loses everything because of what you think you're gonna win it all back type thing. We see this earlier in life. He at one point in the 1830s, you talk about a bad hand, if we want to continue the gambling analogy, whatever. But in the 1830s, in a span of about 2 or 3 years, he loses his father figure, who is his brother, a United States senator, who is really more of a father to him than his father, his best friend from West Point, a child, as well as his wife. Now, in a matter of 2 years, you lose all of that. That's going to rock your world a little bit, right? That's going to shake things up a little bit. And so to overcompensate and gamble, what does he do? I'm going to Texas and go with the Texas Revolution, right, in 1836. Probably not what was needed at the time to make this big gamble on life. He leaves his other children back home with relatives, leaves his children, leaves all that, and goes and gambles everything on Texas. And nearly winds up dead because he gets out there and he fights a duel with a guy named Felix Huston over command of the Texas Army, gets shot in the hip, and nearly dies over this foolish gamble, really, to go to Texas, and then certainly to duel over honor type thing. We also see it economically. He's a terrible money manager. He bought a plantation, China Grove, out in Texas, thinking, all right, this is going to be my ticket to riches and all of that. Paid way too much for it. Went into partnership with a guy who paid half. The guy went bankrupt, and Johnston had to assume the other half of the debt, and he was under that debt for pretty much the rest of his life until he was bailed out, actually, by his son. So, economically, we see all these things where he takes the plunge and overcompensates and makes these big, wild gambles trying to regain his equilibrium, and it just doesn't work. Now, you put that type of guy in a military command where you're gambling with lives and all of that kind of stuff, a methodical chess player in a poker player's position, it's not going to turn out very well. So for all of these reasons that we see beforehand, but also during the Civil War, he just doesn't turn out to be a very good general. And so I didn't have to really worry about that hero worship type thing. I don't mind saying he's not a very good general, and I call it like I see it. That's basically what it is. But he does have a big impact on what goes on. Obviously, he's not being a very good general impacts the course of the war in the West through Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, all of that. Of course, it leads to his death at Shiloh, which is another gamble. Shiloh itself is a gamble. We have to reverse these losses that we've been enduring. And he gets on the battlefield, and the battle is not going the way he wants it to. And so the critical point of his big gamble is not going well, so he wades into the battle itself to lead from the front, winds up getting shot, bleeds to death at Shiloh, and dies right there at 2:30 in the afternoon on April the 6th, 1862, depriving the Confederacy, of course, of its highest field commander. Now, in terms of how all that happened and the results, there are a lot of what-ifs, and historians obviously don't want to deal with counterfactuals and all of that. But one of the big ones is, what if Johnston had lived? Would he have won Shiloh? And there are a lot, I don't know how it goes up here. I'm guessing there's not a lot of Southern neo-Confederate, South's gonna rise again type stuff up here in Pennsylvania. I don't know, there may be. But down south, there's a lot of that. And the mentality is, had Johnston lived, the South would have won that battle and won the Civil War and all that kind of stuff. It's synonymous with Nathan Bedford Forrest. You just put Nathan Bedford Forrest in charge and the South would have won, which is crazy. But at any rate, it's that mentality. I well remember, I was working, I see several park rangers here today, I was working the desk at Shiloh one day, and this guy came in, and you can, if you're one of these, no offense, but you can always tell them when they walk in, that this is going to be good. So he walked up and he propped his arm up on the desk and he said, "You may not know this." And I thought, oh boy, here we go. He said, "But if Albert Sidney Johnston had lived, we'd have won this battle, we'd have won that war." I said, "You're exactly right. I did not know that. Thank you for enlightening me here." But that's the mentality. You look, those of you who've been to Shiloh, you've seen the UDC monument, that death and night, the South handing the wreath of victory to death and night, the death of Albert Sidney Johnston, running out of daylight, all of that. Johnston is central in basically explaining why the South lost Shiloh. Now, I don't happen to agree with that, and I differ with Professor Rowland on this, in terms of outcome and all that. And this is a whole nother talk, a whole nother tour. Come do a tour with me at Shiloh or something, and we'll, actually we are, Karen, aren't we? But at any rate, I don't think Johnston's death had any measurable impact on Shiloh, and it's largely because of terrain. If you've read Shiloh Conqueror Perish, I go into terrain, and that's the key feature to me, particularly Grant's last line. As the Confederates are moving toward the end of the day, toward Grant's last line, we see a very, very strong line there that the Confederates probably aren't going to break no matter who's in command, whether it's Albert Sidney Johnston, or whether it's P.G.T. Beauregard, or whether it's Napoleon Bonaparte, or even Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain probably couldn't have broken. We are at Gettysburg after all. They're not going to break that last line of defense. Now, that's another thing. A lot of these Confederates and all that talk about, if they had just made one more push, not run out of daylight, or if that idiot Beauregard hadn't called off the attacks and all that, we'd have pushed them into the river and won the battle and all that kind of stuff. And most of the ones that say this haven't even been to Shiloh, much less gotten off the tour route and walked through those ravines. How many of you have walked through Deal Branch Ravine? Wally, I don't remember, did we walk through Deal Branch Ravine? We've got several that have walked. I don't want to be, what's the word I'm looking for, uppity or whatever about this, but people have argued about taking Grant's last line of defense. But you can't even start arguing about this, and I guess the contention is, don't argue with me about it until we get on the same page and you go walk through Deal Branch Ravine and see the terrain that the Confederates would have to move through to take Grant's last line of defense. Then we can discuss, we can argue, and if you come to the different conclusion from me, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. I'm not the end all be all. My word doesn't, is not gospel, anything like that. But there at least has to be a common starting point, so don't even discuss it unless you go and look at the terrain and see from a level playing field what's going on here. So I don't think Johnston's death played that big a role. I don't think the Confederates have a chance to win Shiloh even if Johnston had lived. And you throw in all the methodical, leniency and all of that, who knows what might have happened had he lived. So that's one controversy that we really don't know what would have happened, but my take on it is it wouldn't have made any difference. Now, the other one is much more important, I think, and I'll kind of finish with this. Wayne, I think we got time for some questions maybe as we go through. The other kind of what if is what would have happened had Johnston lived in the rest of the war? Would he have continued to command? Would he have been so bad that Jefferson Davis would have removed him? Well, probably not. Jefferson Davis doesn't remove hardly anybody until they just get so bad that he has to. And remember, this is Davis's friend. They are just absolutely bosom buddies there. So Davis is probably not going to remove Johnston at any point, but what would have happened had Johnston lived? And here's the question normally posed: would Johnston have become the Western Robert E. Lee? And we know about Robert E. Lee and up to Gettysburg and all of that. Robert E. Lee is revered as a military commander, right? Well, Johnston doesn't have the opportunity that Lee has to basically learn from his mistakes. You look at Lee in the 7 Days Peninsula Campaign. He stumbled a lot, didn't he? Getting coordination and all of that. He lived through that, though. That's the key. Lee lived through it and was able maybe to learn from his mistakes and put those into effect later on. Johnston doesn't have that luxury of living through his mistakes and learning as he goes forward. And so that's the argument. I don't really agree with that argument either. Number one, Johnston did have a lot of mistakes early on. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, he never seemed to learn from them. Like Lee begins to learn, he never seems to learn from those. Number two, you throw in the whole methodical thing, the whole leniency thing and all that, and I just don't think Johnston has the not mentality, but the makeup to become the Lee that Lee became. And in fact, looking at all this, I'm not sure, but what Lee's failures in the 7 Days and Peninsula Campaign early on and all that, I'm not sure those were mistakes of makeup, mentality, and all that. Those were mistakes maybe of execution. He had maybe a good plan, it just wasn't executed. Johnston's troubles are from the foundation up. They're inherent, and so they're not problems of execution. They're problems of inherent makeup. So I think there's a very different mentality there. So I'm not sure Johnston would have become the Western Lee that everybody thinks he would. But that's all kind of counterfactual. We don't know the answer to that. We do know, however, and again I'll end with this. We do know what does happen when Johnston dies at Shiloh. It deprives the Confederacy, again, of the highest-ranking field commander, but it also deprives the Confederacy of anybody in the West who could be acceptable enough both to the administration in Richmond and the soldiers in the Army and the general population of the Confederacy. Because look what happens here. You've got those 5 full generals, right? Okay, look in the spring of 1862. What's going on with those generals and who potentially could have replaced Johnston? Of course, Johnston's dead. He's not going to replace himself. Samuel Cooper's not leaving Richmond in his desk, so there's 2 down. Joseph E. Johnston, what happens to Joseph E. Johnston that spring? He's wounded at around Richmond, right, in the Peninsula Campaign. Who replaces Johnston? Robert E. Lee. So 4 of the 5 are taken up there. Well, Beauregard, of course, is Johnston. The 5th one is Johnston's second in command. He go over the Army, promptly loses Corinth without a battle. And get this, he sends Richmond word in mid-May that we have to fight here. If we lose Corinth, we lose the Mississippi Valley and probably our cause. He places that kind of importance on Corinth. And then just a mere 2 weeks later, he retreats without fighting a battle. What does that tell the administration in Richmond? Either this guy's nuts or he's a coward. And I won't say he's a coward, but he is pretty much nuts. I'm not a fan of Beauregard either. At any rate, the idea is that Beauregard is unacceptable to Davis. And we all know the problems that he's having with Davis and all of that. So Beauregard is not a permanent solution. Lee's tied up. Johnston's wounded, and Johnston's just as hated as Beauregard by Davis. Cooper's not coming out. So you don't have another full general. So you replace Johnston with somebody that's not currently a full general. So you dip down into a lower rank and pull somebody up, right? And who is that? Braxton Bragg. Okay. You take one of the 4 corps commanders in the Army and boot them up to a full general to command the Army. Now, the problem with this is you bring somebody who is an equal to the other corps commanders, boot them up over the others, some over seniority, and it creates a mess, right? We've got a situation in which an equal becomes the commander, and those other equals have a hard time accepting this because for the next 18 months, it's a miserable time out west for Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee. And who are Bragg's chief critics? The other 3 corps commanders that were not pushed up, right? William Hardy, Leonidas Polk, and John C. Breckinridge. You can't find 3 more bitter Bragg enemies than those other corps commanders that were not promoted, but Bragg was. So you take somebody, take the Park Service hierarchy here. If you take somebody, let's just say a seasonal, and boot them up to superintendent over all these others that have been in the Park Service for, and that's a hypothetical situation, of course, but over people who've been in the Park Service for 30, 40 years, there's going to be some resentment there, right? So you can see the problem here with booting Bragg up, and, just by extension, Bragg not being a very good general, that causes some issues as well. So over the course of the next 18 months, as Bragg commands the Army of Tennessee, he's taking all of these shots from behind from the corps commanders who are jealous. He's taking, losing battle after battle to the Federals as they fight through the Kentucky campaign, Stones River, Tullahoma, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, all of that. It ends in disaster. The question is, if Johnston had lived, would he have done any better than Bragg? I think Leah Grace back there is 14 years old, could have done better than Bragg. I'm not sure. But the idea is Johnston was seen as head and shoulders above all the corps commanders, so at least they would have offered him deference and would have known their position in relation to him rather than bringing somebody who is an equal up over the former equals there. So my contention is Johnston's not a very good general, but in terms of what the Confederacy had available, he was probably, had he not died, the best that could have been available. Certainly would have done better than Bragg, because what you're doing, to a baseball analogy here, and I know we're up in Phillydom here, and I hate to even mention the Orioles. We're in the Orioles here, but the Phillies are doing good. Beat the Braves last night. At any rate, a major league team that's just not very good. We'll take the Marlins this year or something like that. If they don't have major league ready players, what do you have to do? You have to dip down into the minor leagues and bring people up who are not quite ready, but you got to fill a roster, right? And so the Confederacy essentially is reaching down with Bragg and others into AAA and bringing some up that maybe aren't quite ready. And as we continue to have attrition, you're getting down into like AA and maybe single A when you bring John Pemberton and Earl Van Dorn and people like that up to the major leagues. And they're just not ready, and it causes problems for the Confederacy. And we see that with Albert Sidney Johnston's death here, who gambled his life away, told everybody, I'm going to roll the iron dice of battle. We have to conquer or perish. And, of course, at Shiloh, he perished rather than conquered. Thank you very much. If we have time for questions, I'm not sure. Thank you very much for having us up. We've enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Wonderful. We're going to ask Dr. Smith to get in. If you want to have a further conversation, you're going to have to do it under a copy of the Iron Dice of Battle. So get your copy in there. We'll see you all back here at 11 o'clock, everybody, in the tent. Bring your Heinz ketchup for Pittsburgh in the Civil War, right?